So welcome everyone, this is Keith Brown at the Melikian Center at Arizona State University, and delighted that you're joining us for this presentation, the first of two public presentations with our virtual visitor from Hawaii, as you can envy in her background, Cynthia Lazaroff. We're really delighted that Cynthia agreed to join us for this, and really looking forward to a couple of public sessions with her, conversations after that, and she's also meeting with other groups during this virtual visit to Arizona State. Just a little bit of background before I turn it over to Cynthia. First, to let you know, she will be talking today for about 35 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A afterwards. And she'll be doing a similar length presentation tomorrow at 6 p.m., tomorrow being Thursday at 6 p.m. So we asked for two presentations because there are at least two sides to Cynthia's work and profile. I'll give you a little bit of an intro that talks a little bit about what it is, why we're so excited to have her here. Cynthia's an exemplary citizen diplomat, featured in one of the first accounts of Soviet-American citizen diplomacy from the 1980s, which is where I first came across her name and was curious to find out where she was now, especially having learned that Cynthia comes from a Macedonian family. The last name Lazaroff gives that away. And it turns out that after that initial work in citizen diplomacy, where she was, she co-founded and served as executive director of the USSR Youth Exchange Program, which she founded in 1983. And this was after her undergraduate studies at Princeton. She subsequently maintained and built her ties with the Soviet Union and now Russia. At the time that her website was created, she had visited, she made over 40 trips to Russia and the former Soviet Union since 1978. That number may have gone up since that. One of the things she's done more recently is develop what she terms third side mediation, conflict resolution, and citizen diplomacy. So this is part of the track 2 impulse to broaden diplomatic exchanges between former adversaries. And she's developed alongside that a particular focus on the threat that nuclear overarmament, let's say, continues to pose to our world, even at this time, when there are all kinds of other crises competing for our attention. She's the founder of nuclearwakeupcall.earth. And as part of that initiative, which aims to reduce nuclear risk by promoting dialogue between especially Russia and the US, part of that initiative, she's also launched recently a program entitled Women Transforming Our Nuclear Legacy, very aware from her own experience of the ways in which women's participation has been marginalized or minimalized, especially in foreign policy circles and training in political science. And so she's also working actively to address that by mentoring young women to enter the profession and the discipline. So there's a lot to talk about. As I said, we asked her to talk today about primarily her nuclear focused work, and tomorrow more about her life as a citizen diplomat. So again, delighted to welcome Cynthia Lazaroff, and Cynthia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Keith, for that really kind introduction. I'm really overwhelmed. Thank you. And to you and David and all of you at the Melikian Center for inviting me here today. It's for this truly existential conversation. It's an honor to be here with you all. And I'm so grateful for all you do at the center to fulfill your mission and, as you say, to offer insight and to combat prejudice and disinformation in and on this critical region of the world, which today, when it comes to Russia, is more important than ever, especially in terms of, as we're going to speak about today, the stakes in U.S.-Russia relations. So I'm truly grateful for all you all are doing there. It's really it's really very inspiring and impressive. So thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Start by doing that. Just do this a second. After the Berlin Wall came down and the Cold War came to an end, I thought I could stop worrying about nuclear war and went on to do many other things related to coral reefs and climate change and ocean conservation, biosphere conservation. All of that changed for me in 2017 when I was asked to work on a film about US-Russia relations and nuclear dangers. And I interviewed dozens of top experts in the US and Russia and former officials. And pretty much everybody I spoke to awakened me to today's staggering nuclear danger. Every interview truly was a wake-up call for me. And I just want to play a brief clip from the introduction to the nuclear section of what is a 7-part documentary to give you a glimpse of what I was hearing in some of these interviews that really woke me up.
The first warning, if it were from intercontinental ballistic missiles, would come from infrared satellites that would detect the plume of heat from the rockets. The United States then maintains a posture to try and validate that with a totally different sort of physical system.
Then they send it on to the president, and he has 7, 8, 9 minutes to decide whether to launch our ICBMs or let them be destroyed in their silos. It's the worst decision anybody could ever have to make. No human being ought to have to make that decision.
And today, I think the Russian population and the American population is virtually living in denial, when the fact is that while the arsenals have been reduced, they're still on Cold War postures, launch on warning.
Even a relatively small-scale nuclear exchange between the United States and Russia will lead to hundreds of millions dead. And a large-scale exchange of nuclear weapons between the United States and Russia would lead to no less than the end of civilization.
The US-Russian relationship is a unique relationship in as much as it is very much defined still by the nuclear dimension. We're the world's two nuclear superpowers. We have the ability not only to destroy ourselves several times over, but for other countries. And we have a joint interest in non-proliferation.
Very few people, public or politicians or policymakers, are recognizing the complexities and dangers of what is now a multipolar nuclear world that is slowly spinning out of control. It's no longer just US and Soviet or US and Russia, but that relationship now has a China dimension. India and Pakistan, which is not just bilateral, that now has a China dimension. And we know from recent headlines the risks and the dangers of nuclear escalation on the Korean Peninsula.
There's a huge array of technological change that has really deeply impacted the security of nuclear arsenals and therefore potential nuclear risks.
Do we really want to have the other parties who have nuclear weapons thinking that there's a possibility that we could deactivate their nuclear deterrent through cyber means? That's super nuclear instability and insecurity.
We should be leading the rest of the world in doing these things. And we're not doing that. So that's what concerns me today about what's wrong with US-Russia relations. So it's not just the threats, but we're not taking advantage of what we need to do. That's really unfortunate. And by the way, my Russian nuclear colleagues feel exactly the same way that I do.
With regard to Russia's US non-proliferation cooperation, this is the area of my concern. Even during the Cold War, it was one of the areas where two countries were cooperating closely.
Well, I am very concerned about what is going on, having lived through an awful lot of how these agreements were made and how important they were to get from mutually assured destruction to kind of having functional arms control agreements, and having it not only be an arena where we were dealing with arms control, but also learning how to deal with each other. They really provided venues for having important discussions about what we had in common, what we had to try to figure out.
В ходе переговоров у тебя складываются соответствующие отношения, когда иногда достаточно взгляда, чтобы понять, на что партнер готов. И я, опять-таки, из своего опыта, уже будучи министром, у меня в этом отношении при всех разногласиях были очень партнерские отношения и с госсекретарем Олбрайт, и с госсекретарем Пауэллом.
We have a New START treaty that expires in 2021. It's time to start thinking about the next phase of arms control.
There is a word in Russian language, which is fortochka. Fortochka is a small window. And I see currently, we still have that small window of opportunity in our relationship. Not a big window, but a fortochka. And my biggest worry is that a strong wind will shut down that fortochka, will shut down that small window, and the moment of opportunity will be lost for a long time.
So that just gives you a small glimpse of what I heard in these interviews. And there's a whole section in the documentary that goes much deeper. But as I said, pretty much everybody awakened me to the staggering nuclear danger today. The two people who, sorry about that, the two people who awakened me the most and had the greatest impact on me were our US former Secretary of Defense, William Perry, and former Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. Secretary Perry said to me that the risk of a nuclear catastrophe today is greater than at any time in history. This is even than during the Cold War. And he said, most people are blissfully unaware of this danger. And then he said, we are sleepwalking into a nuclear catastrophe and we must wake up. At that moment, I realized that I'd been sleepwalking since the end of the Cold War. And for me to actually take that in was personally devastating. I'm just going to play literally a very short clip from Secretary Perry, what he said, that relates to the topic today of what we need to do to restore the dialogue with Russia on nuclear cooperation and nuclear issues.
Because we don't understand the dangers, we make no attempt, no serious attempt to repair the hostility between the United States and Russia. And so we are allowing ourselves to sleepwalk into another catastrophe. We must wake up.
This was in November of 2017 that I interviewed Secretary Perry, and a few weeks later I was flying back to Moscow, where I had the honor and privilege of spending an afternoon with a former Soviet leader who, as I was coming of age and with this work in my 20s, I so admired and have admired ever since. He is deeply concerned, as is Secretary Perry and many of the experts we interviewed, about the new arms race. And, he said that our relations have been going from bad to worse, deeply concerned about that. And the words, we must break out of this situation. We won't survive if someone loses their nerves in the current tension. So this was all, had a deep impact on me as I reflected on where we were at that point in relations. And he ended with these words.
Если соревнование начнется на этом направлении, мы погубим всех и планету погубим.
So essentially, he's saying that if we continue to allow our relations to go in the direction that they're going, we're going to destroy everything and everyone in the whole planet. So I came home from those interviews with Gorbachev in the middle of December 2017, here where I live on the island of Kauai. And that's the mountain right behind me where I'm sitting right now. And this moment, if you might remember, was at the height of the fire and fury between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. And nuclear tensions were particularly high here in Hawaii at the time because we knew that we had been marked as a target on Pyongyang's nuclear map of death. Tensions were so high that we were actually getting instructions from our government on how to prepare for a nuclear attack and how to survive a nuclear attack. All of this and the interviews were present in my consciousness and in my awareness. A few weeks later, on the morning of January 13th, 2018, when we awoke to this sunrise that was hauntingly beautiful. We get many beautiful sunrises here. We're on the Eastern Shore, but we had never seen a sunrise like this. And so we took a photograph of it, as you can see. Very shortly thereafter, I was sitting in our living room in the middle of a conversation when I was one of over 1 million people across the Hawaiian Islands who received this text message on my cell phone. Ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. So my first instinct was, is this real? Is this a hoax? We have to find out if it's real. So we started dialing 911 and it was busy. We kept dialing 911. It stayed busy because everybody across the Hawaiian Islands, we were all dialing 911 at the same time and none of us could get through to get the answer. So at this point, we thought of our girls and my partner, Bruce, said, I don't know if this is real or not, but I'm gonna go get the girls. They were in Kapa'a, 7 miles away, a town down the road. And so he was rushing out the door and I said, wait a second. We need a plan. I don't want to be separated. If it is real, we need a plan of where we're going to meet. And he said, call me in the car and we'll figure it out. So he was out the door and I stood there feeling dazed for a moment. And then I thought, who do I know who knows? Who's going to know if it's real? And I remembered my dear friend, Felicia Cowden, who's a journalist. She's the first to know anything and everybody takes her phone call. And I thought, Felicia will know. So I started calling her, I texted her, I looked at her Facebook page, no answer, nothing. And after what seemed really like an eternity to me, but it was only a few minutes, Felicia called me back and she said, Cynthia, the county is telling us to take shelter. And at that moment, I thought, my God, this is real. I have to take this seriously. So the first thing was, where do we go? There are no designated nuclear shelters in Hawaii. And so we remembered that our neighbor has a meditation cave built into the side of a cliff that's pretty well sealed. It was the most sealed place that we could think of. So we decided that we would shelter there. And then the next thing was, well, what do I take with me? And I looked at my phone and it had 12% charge. And I thought, my God. So then I thought, my phone charger. And then I thought, well, is there an outlet in the cave? And then I thought, well, there are lights there, so maybe there's an outlet. So I started throwing things into a bag. My phone charger, my computer charger, my purse, my passport. And then I thought, am I going to really need any of these things if we're hit by a nuclear missile? I mean, and then I thought, well, I just have to try to survive. And so then I took a shawl to wrap around my face in case of radiation, and then leggings to cover my legs for the same reason. And then I thought food and water for our family. And I thought, oh my God, I've done nothing to prepare our family for this. We're supposed to have 14 days of water per person and 14 days of canned food. And there were 4 of us. And I had 2 small bottles of water on the shelf. I threw those into the bag and a bunch of bananas. And the next thing was, I don't have time to walk. I don't know how many minutes we have. I don't know if it's 1 minute or 5 minutes or 10 minutes. So I jumped in the car. And it was at that moment, and only at that moment, that I allowed myself to think of my eldest daughter in LA. She had just left for a few days before. And I thought, I have to call her. I have to let her know. I have to say goodbye. So I started dialing her as I was driving, and she wasn't picking up, and it was ringing and ringing still when I jumped out of the car to run to the steps leading up the hillside to the cave. And finally, at the footsteps, just below the steps to the cave, she picked up. And I said, Mackenzie, I don't know if you've heard, but we've all got a message on our cell phones here that we're going to be hit by a nuclear missile. We're going to go and shelter in the cave. And I just want you to know that I love you, and I'll call you from the cave again if I can. And she said, Mom, I love you too. And at that moment, time stopped for me. I didn't want to let her go. And I thought, am I ever going to hear her voice again? Am I ever going to see her again? Is this the last connection we're going to have in this life? And then I thought, wait a second, is this not just about me and her? And is this not just one nuclear missile from North Korea, but could this be the beginning of one of those accidental nuclear wars that Secretary Perry and Soviet leader Gorbachev and others were all of those experts were talking about, that they're so worried about an accidental nuclear war between the United States and Russia? Are there many missiles right now on the way from Russia? And we launched many missiles back. And is this the beginning of the end of life as we know it? Is this the beginning of the end of everyone and everything we know and love and cherish? And as my mind was going off in all of these thoughts, and I was standing there, I suddenly heard, Mom, go, go. My daughter was telling me to hang up. And I said, I didn't want to hang up, but I said, I love you. And I started running up the hill to the cave and ran up the steps and then on the hill above the steps. And as I got to the door of the cave and went to open it, it opened. And it was my neighbor, Colleen. And she was holding up her phone and she was smiling. And she said, it was a false alarm. One second, I'm going to share my screen again. So it took 38 minutes for our government to send us this text message that said, there is no missile threat or danger to the state of Hawaii. Repeat, false alarm. Even with everything I knew and had learned professionally about nuclear war, nuclear fallout, nuclear winter, radiation, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, all of it, nuclear war was truly unimaginable to me until I went through those 38 minutes. And now, as a mother, as a human being, that experience lives inside of me. It was a visceral awakening. It's in my gut, and it's not going to go away until we eliminate nuclear weapons. And that's really why I'm actually here speaking to you today. So after I had this experience, the feeling immediately was, the minute I got home, was, I have to write this down while it's fresh. And I just started chronicling moment by moment what had happened that day. And I then started thinking about all the things that I'd learned in the documentary, and just everything. It just felt like it was important to share it, to serve, to have other people know what it was like to have this experience as a way to perhaps make a difference. And I felt compelled to share the experience in every way possible. Ultimately, those journals became an article that was published on Hiroshima Day 8 months later in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. And then I was honored when it was published on the front page of the liberal daily in Russia, Kommersant, for a weekend. And that was the beginning of the story really going around. I've since had the honor of sharing the story in many different venues, and very recently, Secretary Perry's granddaughter, Lisa Perry, inspired by her grandfather, created a podcast series with Secretary Perry called At the Brink that I highly recommend. It is a wonderful teaching on so many aspects of nuclear dangers. And Secretary Perry and I share the first episode where we both speak about our experiences of nuclear false alarms. He experienced one in the Pentagon, which he also describes was left in his gut. He uses the same word that I did. And so that was a huge wake-up call for him. So also I'm working on a VR simulation with the Nuclear Futures Lab at Princeton and a number of other production companies where you'll walk into an installation and you'll actually have a VR experience of going through the false alarm. I also started a nonprofit called Nuclear Wakeup Call.Earth as a vehicle for sharing the story and doing other things. And the mission really is, as Keith mentioned at the beginning, to catalyze efforts in US-Russia relations to reduce the escalating nuclear danger and to work with Russia and people in all countries to work towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. We do education, track 2 and track point 1 diplomacy, what I call purposeful cultural exchange, mediation and negotiation, and we work to compel our leaders to adopt the steps of the nuclear playbook. I'm going to be talking more tomorrow about the citizen diplomacy initiatives, but I'll just say today that sort of the question that we ask when we're thinking about what to do is what kind of exchange could actually have the capacity to break through the deadlock that could rise above and transcend the political differences and take people out of their heads and into their hearts, into connection where we actually can change the relationship, to start the dialogue, to keep ourselves all here. So I'll be talking more tomorrow, but one we've done with a concert tour here with a Hawaii artist who just shares the spirit of aloha wherever he goes and opens hearts. We did that in Russia. We're working on a gathering of indigenous peoples in the Bering Strait for peace, which will take place next summer on Solstice 2021. My most favorite educational seminar is, which we've done for legislative staff in Washington, we've done for students in different parts of the world, and is to actually take people through a simulation of getting a photoshopped image on their cell phone that says, inbound ballistic missile threat to Moscow or Washington, D.C., or wherever they are, and they go through the experience of the 38 minutes and having to make those choices as a way to kind of just wake people up, to share the experience, to think about what we might do to actually change our nuclear story. And we do track 1.5 discussions on nuclear risk reduction, when the track 1, which is the official channel of communication, which is state actors, government to government, when that's kind of closed down, track 2, citizen to citizen, and track 1.5, which is often a combination between state actors and non-state actors. There are vehicles to actually have the conversations that need to be happening in track 1, not as a replacement, but as a way to kind of search for solutions and create the context for the shift in the relationship, for the bigger changes that need to be made in nuclear risk reduction to have a chance to happen. And the relationship, as Secretary Perry said in that clip, we have to really repair the hostility to restore the dialogue, to have the conversations that are existential. And we mix it up. We bring music into conversations about nuclear risk reduction, and it just changes everything. It doesn't mean that it solves all the problems, but it takes people out of a place where they're stuck in their positions into a place of connection where a different kind of conversation can happen. So I'm going to talk just briefly about the nuclear playbook. When I was writing the article, I reached a point where I thought, after a couple of months of focusing on the dangers and the experience, I realized that it would leave people in despair. And I had to really come up with something that people could do. And so, inspired by Secretary Perry, by Gorbachev, but by a lot of the experts who have made recommendations of steps we absolutely must take to reduce the risk of a nuclear catastrophe, and also how we work together to eliminate nuclear weapons, I put together these steps. And I'm not going to go into the specific steps much, but I'm going to say a few things about the playbook. It's evolved since the playbook was originally published with the article in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, because nuclear relations are evolving, and there is now a national coalition in the United States called Back from the Brink, preventnuclearwar.org. And the first 5 steps, which were in a different order in the other playbook, have kind of been realigned to go, they're now in alignment with this national movement, and they're the same steps. Many of the steps are still the same, but we're really aligning to build a national coalition to move this along. The steps fall into 2 categories in this playbook. One is steps that absolutely must be done to reduce the immediate nuclear risk, like taking our nuclear weapons off of hair trigger alert, like declaring no first use of nuclear weapons. And also they have things like step number 5, pursuing a verifiable agreement among all nuclear states to eliminate nuclear arsenals. So they both have steps to keep us here long enough so that we can actually eliminate the nuclear weapons, but work on both at the same time. I also included, because a lot of what I'm finding is that a lot of groups in disarmament and national security, because of how toxic the relationship is with Russia, don't really talk about what we have to do with Russia. But we together possess over 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. So we have to take the lead in this. And so you'll see the theme of today's topic: maintain a dialogue on nuclear risk reduction with all nuclear powers, no matter what. And our nuclear dialogue with Russia was largely cut off after the events in Ukraine in 2014. This is making us much less safe. We have to talk to each other like we did during the Cold War. Pretty much no matter what was going on in relations, we always had maintained a safe space for conversations on nuclear risk reduction, arms control, and nuclear cooperation on terrorism and things like that. So, so I really include Russia, and I feel it's very important that we do that because of the reasons that I've mentioned. Many of the steps, especially in the first 5, are tied into legislation that is pending in the Congress. And so there is legislation for no first use, for restricting presidential authority, sole presidential authority, for reducing the risk of modernizing our nuclear arsenal at the cost of $2 trillion, and how we reduce the risk by not carrying out that plan, et cetera, et cetera. I will put in the chat, in the Q&A, there's a lot more information about the playbook on our website and this legislation, which you can find out about and go to that. I want to talk about, briefly mention the project that Keith alluded to at the beginning, which is that as I have re-engaged with this work over the past few years, there's been a call from women in Russia, women here, women in different countries all over the world, for a program that really, really looks to bring women into this conversation at a much bigger level than they have been throughout the nuclear age. A mentoring program, a movement building program, and we've just started this program in September of this year. We've had 3 online global mentoring sessions. We've had women from 8 of the 9 nuclear armed states present. We haven't had North Korea. We have had some women from South Korea involved, so that's been wonderful, and women carrying that Korean hope for denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula and peace between the United States and the end of the Korean War. And so those are all archived online, and I'll put that on the chat. But I just want to take a moment and say, why women and why now? Well, women and girls are disproportionately impacted by nuclear weapons, by ionizing radiation. And since the dawn of the nuclear age, women have been almost entirely shut out of nuclear policymaking and decision-making. And today, women are still grossly underrepresented in national security. I know there was a recent webinar that I actually attended that you all had about women in security and the need to bring more women into security. But essentially, to put it baldly, excluding half of the human race, women, for much of the nuclear age, has brought us to the brink of possible extinction. the research shows that when women are involved in negotiations and peace building processes, peace becomes more possible and agreements more enduring. And it's not because of gender, but because of the attributes of what's called a feminist foreign policy, a feminist peace, that we bring collaborative approaches that advocate dialogue over silence, engagement over isolation, cooperation and diplomacy over conflict and war. So today it's really an existential imperative that we write a new nuclear story, that women come forward to lead, to join in the company of men and the few other women that are in this leadership policy making, to claim their seat at the nuclear table, to transform our nuclear policy and nuclear legacy. And I want to end on a really positive note, which is that in 2017, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, with many partner organizations around the world, individuals and organizations and NGOs, had worked very hard, and the UN adopted the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And it needed 50 countries to ratify it, to come into force. And that ratification just took place last month on United Nations Day, the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. And what this means is that the treaty will enter into force on January 22nd, 2021. And it hasn't been ratified or signed by any of the nuclear armed states, but we had the honor of having with us in our inaugural session for Women Transforming Nuclear Legacy, Ambassador Elaine White Gomez, who negotiated the treaty at the UN in 2017 and brought together 122 countries to adopt the treaty. And I asked her what the meaning was, not knowing exactly when it was going to be ratified, but feeling that it was coming, what it would mean when the treaty came into force. And this is what Ambassador White said.
And it is going to be for the first time that in international law, this is something that really is really outstanding. Countries not only reject, we consider them illegal and not legitimate instruments of security for the 21st century. And that any use of such weapons will be abhorrent to the principles of humanity and the dictates of human conscience. This is going to be a very strong way in which we turn around the official discourse from nuclear weapons are necessary to nuclear weapons are illegal and unacceptable. And that is going to have an impact in policy making. And it is going to be.
Sorry. So may it be so. So just in closing, if this treaty is to come into force on a global scale, and nuclear weapons are going to be eliminated, the US and Russia, with over 90% of the nuclear weapons, are going to have to take the lead. This is a map published by my colleagues at the Arms Control Association. You can see very plainly the numbers of nuclear weapons that Russia and the United States have versus the next largest nuclear power, China. And China has basically said they're not going to talk until we come down to their level. So all this kind of bluster that we've heard about, we have to bring China in, they're basically saying, we'll talk to you when you come down to 300. Then we can have a conversation. So there is a, forgive me for that, there is a verifiable pathway to nuclear weapon, to the elimination of nuclear weapons. That's the most sound and verifiable pathway that's been put out by Global Zero, which actually takes this approach where it graduated verifiable reductions to the level of China and then all the way to zero. But that's where we've got to start. And so it's really up to the US and Russia, which brings us back to the theme of today, that that's not going to happen unless we restore the dialogue and change the relationship and create the safe space that's existential for these kinds of reductions to happen. And I just want to say that for me, the concept of mutually assured destruction and the massive amounts of money being spent on nuclear weapons, the wasted money for so many decades, it's now been 75 years since we first tested the first nuclear weapon and used the first nuclear weapons. It's always been insane. But today, as we are in the middle of a global pandemic, this existential threat, and we face the existential threat of climate change, we have to just see that they're more insane than ever because they offer no solutions or security to these existential threats that we're facing now on the planet. And in fact, the trillions of dollars that are being spent on nuclear weapons and militarism are taking away from the desperately, existentially needed resources we need for the pandemic and climate change. We've seen the vast shortages we've had in ventilators, masks, et cetera, et cetera. So it is more important that we reestablish this dialogue than ever, that we begin to reduce our arsenals, that we work together towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. And there really is no more time for a timeout in the dialogue at this point. You know, we're really, it's an existential threat that we're not talking the way we need to be. And I'll just end with a quote from Ambassador White, who planted the seed also in our inaugural session that history is made by individuals, not and by organizations and governments, but it's really up to each and every one of us. If nuclear weapons can destroy all of us and eliminate all of us, we all have a stake in eliminating them and working together to do that. And we can't leave it up to the experts. They're not going to do it without us. And we're not, and the governments, they need to hear from us that this is important. And so she said, history is made by every single step that we take every day. So my invitation is for all of us to join together to take these steps that are existentially necessary for us to actually survive. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop my share.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. That was great. It was wonderful. I'm going to open it up. You and I had a chance to talk about a lot of this stuff when we were preparing. You know, I've got questions, but let's want to see if other folks on the call want to weigh in. And with small enough group, folks, that if you just want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask a question. Maybe introduce yourself as well if you do. Yeah, Gary, go ahead.
Thank you. Ms. Lazaroff, first of all, thank you very much for your presentation and your magnificent work. My name, by the way, is Gary Grossman. I'm on the faculty in the School for the Future of Innovation and Society. I really am impressed with what you've done, with the passion that you hold for your work. And I have all kinds of curious questions about how did you get into it? You know, how do you sustain yourself and so forth. But I want to ask something maybe a bit from a devil's advocate point of view. Yeah, you're quite right. You know, it's been 75 years since the first and only use of nuclear weaponry. And in that entire 75-year period, there have been people pursuing the kind of thing that you're pursuing, and that is, you know, creating awareness, joining together, trying to create a grassroots movement. I vividly remember, for example, the Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy, I believe they named themselves. What's different now? Why do you think that spreading this awareness is going to work now when in the past success was rather limited?
Thank you. That's an excellent question, and one that I grapple with truly, you know, every day. And I'm just going to start by saying that as someone who did this work through the 1980s and left the work, being reawakened, as I mentioned, it was devastating. And one of the things that kept me awake at night after interviewing Secretary Perry was, how can it be that not only are we back to where we were during the Cold War, but it's worse and it's more dangerous? And how can it be, at least back then we all knew? And I'm going to be talking more about this tomorrow, but at least back then it was omnipresent in our awareness. Everybody knew. We grew up with duck and cover, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And even if you didn't grow up with those, you didn't remember those, in the 1980s, you could not turn on the news, see a cover of a magazine, one of the weekly magazines. It was everywhere. The media actually played a very constructive role of fulfilling their ethical responsibility to keep us constantly informed on the clear and present nuclear danger. That's not happening now. We have this millisecond news cycle and our attention's everywhere else. So now to come to your question, but that as the backdrop of the challenges that we're facing today that we didn't have back then in terms of awareness. So what's different now? What's different now is that the dangers are so much greater for reasons that are very different from some of them are the same as they were during the Cold War, but we have a whole new host of entirely new nuclear dangers. Robert Legvold mentioned the multipolar nuclear world. Back in the 1980s, it was basically a bipolar world. Now we have 9 nuclear powers and we have nuclear aspiring powers. And it's really a multipolar nuclear world where even a limited exchange between India and Pakistan can impact the entire world and the climate, or on the Korean Peninsula, or between China and India, because we've seen tensions there, or between Israel and somewhere else in the Middle East, like Iran. So we've got all of these we've got a multipolar world that's no longer in the control of the 2 superpowers. That's number one. We've got cyber dangers. We've got AI coming in within the next 5 years, estimated as a factor in nuclear decision-making. We've got terrorism. One of the most terrifying things that I learned as I was getting reawakened in 2017 was that that ISIS had been recruiting IT specialists in Russia and that some of them had gone missing, which means that still to this day, there are people, whether being held hostage with guns to their head or whatever, are working on hacking into nuclear command and control. The probability is low, but it's not zero. And even a small infraction would be catastrophic, could be catastrophic. So it could go on and on and on with the new. So we have this, and we also have, as we see with what's happened with the treaty, the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, we see the rise of the Global South. We see 122 countries basically saying, going around the nuclear armed countries and saying, we're not going to wait for you to honor the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. You basically got us to agree not to develop nuclear weapons, but you were supposed to disarm. And you're not doing anything about that right now. So we're not going to wait for you anymore. It's been too long. We're going to make our own treaty. And we're not going to make it dependent on you. And it's about not letting you hold us, the whole entire rest of the world, hostage to your nuclear weapons. So I think we're seeing many things on a global level. Now, when you come back to a national level, like if you come back to what's going on in the United States, it's really one of the most challenging things is competing for attention with all of the other issues right now, and not having a media that is fulfilling its ethical responsibility. So the challenges are there and enormous, but I do think that the world is no longer a world that the United States can control. It's clear. It's a global world. And I think just as we've seen, in our country with what's happened with the murder of George Floyd and systemic racism coming to the fore and Black Lives Matter, and the acknowledgement that this problem is so still with us and unresolved and unhealed, we're now looking at the issues related to nuclear colonialism, to really radioactive racism, the practices of where nuclear weapons are mined, tested, waste is stored, etc. And this whole hostage situation of keeping these other countries hostage, it's racist. So I feel like we're moving into, this is where my hope is, my latest thinking about it, is that I'm seeing with this treaty, which I didn't, when I originally came back in, the nuclear security community was saying it's never going to be ratified. They were wrong. It's been ratified. And we're in a new world. So I have hope. And I also just see in the enthusiasm, and it's not just the women that I'm coming in contact with in different countries, but it's also in the young people, the young men, and intergenerationally with people like Daniel Ellsberg, for example, William Perry. I mean, we're all saying, my mentor from Princeton, Richard Falk, we're all saying the same thing. It's existential. It's a choice. We have a choice. If we don't deal with this one, if we don't get this one right, nothing else matters. Long-winded answer. Sorry. I can't hear you.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm going to enjoy the rest of the questions and look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
Okay.
I have a question, if nobody else does. First of all, thank you for your time today. I greatly enjoyed your presentation. Sorry, my name is Spencer Ariavich, and I'm a junior undergraduate here at ASU. And my question was also sort of a devil's advocate, maybe sort of cynical response to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, particularly. So what would you say to someone, presumably one of the P5 nuclear powers, who would say that, you know, the treaty, you know, it actually takes away from the conversation, you know, it distracts from, you know, any sort of real progress that, you know, we might be trying to do, or, you know, it's sort of smoke and mirrors, because you know, all the countries that have signed it don't have nuclear weapons, so it's really easy for them to, you know, make that commitment. What would sort of your response be to people who say, you know, like the US or someone, or Russia, who are saying, you know, this isn't a good treaty?
Well, and thank you. It's a really, really good question, an important question, and one that, you know, I've been really looking at, and a lot of people in the field are looking at right now. As I mentioned, it wasn't taken seriously in the community. And I think, you know, I saw a post the day that it was, that the treaty was ratified by the 50th country. I saw a post saying, you know, in a couple of years ago, that there was a poll in the nuclear security community or something, and 95% of the community said it would never be ratified. Well, and 5% got it right. So and there is this kind of, in fact, even within the community, and one of the things that I've seen that it sort of breaks my heart is there are divisions in, you know, well, there are different approaches that have to be respected to disarmament. You know, there's traditional arms control. There are people who think we just need to build more weapons. That's on one extreme. Then there are people who, you know, say that we need traditional arms control, and that's the vehicle, and we need to just deal with the nuclear powers. And then there are people, you know, at the other end who are with the treaty, let's say. It's a wide spectrum. But I think that we, and some of the work that we're doing with different projects, is to really look at where the common ground is. And we all have an interest in staying here, right? So you start there. Now to the treaty itself. You know, and I asked Ambassador White some of these questions in the session, because she had spent so much time working on it. It was not easy to get 122 countries to adopt the treaty, even though they weren't any nuclear armed states. There were fierce debates. One of the things I want to mention before I continue is that this treaty is different than other arms control treaties, nuclear arms control treaties, different than all the others, because it's based on humanitarian law and not on military law. And one of the reasons that it got passed is because it looks at the disproportionate impact of nuclear weapons on indigenous peoples, on women and girls, on peoples of color, It takes all of that into account. And so it's in a kind of different category. So it's just to start there. Secondly, you know, Ambassador White said, these things take time. Look at the abolition of slavery. What this is going to do is, and what it's already doing, is creating a mandate, a moral mandate that hasn't existed in a framework, an instrument of law that really bans nuclear weapons like we have done landmines, et cetera, puts them into that category. And so it's something that's going to take time, but it's going to have a moral force. Now, as far as this, some people have said, oh, it's going to interfere with the NPT. It's going to, you know, why don't you just let us go? Well, look at what the NPT hasn't done. Others are saying it actually provides a moral, and these are nuclear arms, nuclear security people. It actually provides a moral basis for the nuclear armed states fulfilling their legal obligation to disarm. So it actually can support existing structures. And that's really the direction I think it's going to go. And even when I think about it, as you're asking me this question, you know, as I've watched and read the articles on both sides of this issue as the 50th ratification has happened in this last month. And there are a lot of really good ones in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, by the way, if you're interested in going deeper into this subject. You see a real, you see somewhat of a division in the conversation, not exclusively, but there is, you know, people from the global South, people of color, people who are being held hostage to this, have a different point of view and have to be listened to. And if we're going to be serious about transforming racism in our own country, we have to deal with it with the world. And nuclear colonialism and radioactive racism, we have to deal with that too. It's all connected. So I don't know, I hope that helps. Okay. Good.
No, I'm going to take the chair's privilege. So this is not a devil's advocate question. It's a kind of practical question, which is, I mean, I'm very struck by that. I did not know that that was China's position. And I'm just wondering, okay, so two parts. One is you sort of flag the responsibility of the media to cover this and to raise awareness. So I just want to check in whether your sense is that if there's awareness, then something will change. So that's the first thing. Like,
if there's a what? I'm sorry.
If there is public awareness, then there will be pressure and there will be a force for change. So that's one sort of question of whether that's where you see the effectiveness. And then the second thing I'm thinking about is especially, you know, we're hopefully moving into a new realm of politics in the US, but a lot of people are flagging that Trumpism will persist. And one of the most powerful rhetorical moves of Trumpism seems to be people not wanting to feel like they're chumps, right? The appeal, people don't want to feel like they're chumps, like they're being taken advantage of, like someone else is doing something smarter than them. I'm just wondering if I'm curious what the China rationale for why 320 warheads is enough. And the cost effectiveness of having 320 warheads as opposed to 6,000 warheads, and whether you see space for the media or others sort of flagging, look, there's a rational, you know, yes, our moral narrative wants to, we've got a moral narrative, but we can also, if you're not interested in our moral narrative, let us tell you the practical narrative of how China is calculating how many nuclear weapons is enough, and how the US policy is kind of self-destructive in the sense that, you know, there's a peace dividend to be reaped, and we're just leaving it in the silos. We're not putting that financial investment to work elsewhere where it's needed. So I'm just curious, sorry, that's a very long-winded thing, but but how you see this powerful moral narrative, which was, you pointed out the parallels to abolitionism. That was clearly one part of it, but it really gained traction when people were making the economic argument as well. I'm just curious how you see the campaign pulling those two threads together.
Again, this is such an excellent question. It's and so let me address the different pieces of it. Let me start with something that I'm going to be talking a little bit about tomorrow, just to address the media. Somehow, and this is something I want to do in 2021, I want to bring together journalists to reawaken them and at least get some kind of commitment on the part of some to, and there are people doing it anyway, but there's really like a handful of people compared to what there were in the past who are really covering this issue and keeping it front and center, because we need that. We need them to partner with us like they did in the 1980s. And they really did partner with us, and I'll talk about that tomorrow. And I just want to mention the example, especially for people who won't be here tomorrow, of The Day After, which, was this ABC television movie in 1983, which is still every bit as watchable and riveting as it was back then, which had an audience, still the largest audience in television history of 100 million Americans, all watching it at the same time on the same night. And it really, if you weren't already awake, you were awake after watching that movie. But the most important thing I want to say about that is that changed Ronald Reagan's mind. That, along with the near accidental nuclear war experiences that we had in that period of 1983 and earlier in his administration, when he watched The Day After, he said that it left him feeling very depressed. And within 2 years, he had a change of heart. Within 2 years, he went from being the president who had called the Soviet Union the evil empire to launching just a few months before and launching the largest military nuclear arms buildup in history up to that point, to actually sitting down with Gorbachev to eliminate nuclear weapons from the face of the earth. Quote from Ronald Reagan. So the media film has power that can break through instantly. So looking at also what's the 20th, what is the day after for 2020 or 2021 or the 2020s? What is the day after? What is the analog? Those are the questions that we'll be looking at tomorrow. So the media is one point. I want to come now to the really important question of China and their number of nuclear weapons and the role of China in the world today. We have, okay, first of all, it takes less than 1/2, something like 1/2%, 1/2% of the world's existing nuclear weapons to destroy life many times over. If you look at the percentage of China's nuclear weapons versus the US and Russia's nuclear weapons, you don't need very many weapons to deter if you believe in deterrence. Like if you put the deterrence hat on, we're an overkill, but on steroids. And so China has been very wise, because even North Korea, look, they only have what, somewhere between estimates are 25 to 35. We don't know exactly how many. They're deterring. And they use Libya as the example why they're not giving up their nuclear weapons, because Gaddafi came in from the cold, stopped his nuclear program. And what did he get? He got tortured and assassinated, right? And the country of Libya was destroyed. And, Saif Gaddafi in an interview said our biggest mistake was giving up our nuclear weapons. And that's what the North Koreans say. So you don't need a lot of nuclear weapons. You just need, to start to deter. Now, I don't like to go into deterrence, but if you put that hat on, it only takes one nuclear weapon dropped on any city, or a dirty nuclear bomb in New York City, or would be catastrophic and lead to great, a huge impact on our economy and things like that. So so China, instead of spending trillions on wars in Iraq and Middle East and all the, as we have done. They've invested in their infrastructure, in their education, in their people. And so they are really way ahead in many areas than the United States, because we've wasted our blood and treasure on weapons. And so China has been wise to not be wasting this money. Now they may be increasing their weapons over time. They may be shifting their, there are all kinds of moves that China is making in places like the South China Sea and places like that that are of concern on the Western side. But I think that they know that they don't really need any more. Then, I mean, the 300 is way overkill already. And so they've been wisely investing in the places that we should have been investing, that wouldn't leave us so vulnerable and exposed in the middle of a pandemic, because our resources have been going to war instead of health and medical equipment and existential supplies right now, as we're moving towards 300,000 dead. If you take those estimates accurately, maybe more, we don't know. Could be. So I don't know if that addresses your question. And the question of wanting to be taken advantage of, maybe you can explain a little bit more what you'd like to, how do you like me to address that part of your question?
It was really just in the frame of right now, as you've just indicated, the US policy looks dumber than Chinese policy. And I'm just, I'm just wondering, for parts of US public opinion where the moral narrative doesn't necessarily grab, maybe it's just sort of thinking about, because I absolutely agree with your point that there's a sort of awareness and then action to follow the awareness on a sort of massive scale that might bring about change in this. And well, I'm just thinking about that, the different ways in which different parts of the US population, different framings resonate to bring about that awakening.
Well, it's really interesting, because I've been asked to speak on Monday on the new Cold War with China. And I said, look, I'm not a China expert, I'm a Russia expert, but I've been what I've been watching, there is this, China is becoming the new enemy in the rhetoric. I mean, Russia's a different kind of enemy. They're like the long-term enemy, and Russia's toxic, etc. But people say we have to, we've been hearing, we have heard the Trump administration, and we've even heard somewhat in the Biden administration, the Biden team, talking about reckoning with China. And I think that a lot of people are fearing China right now because they're so dominant. But why are they so dominant? Because they've made wise choices with their resources, and they haven't had their focus on regime change wars that have cost so much money. And so I think that, your question is really, really important, because I think that part of the key is to have people understand this. And I heard from my stepfather, who was an inventor and a really world traveler and a very, very brilliant man, that when he made his first trip to China, and this was in the late 90s or early 2000s, he said, China's so far ahead of us. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, they're the future. And then I worked with a team we worked a lot in Asia when I was doing my coral reef work. And I made my first trip to Hong Kong and Singapore. And this was in about 2007, 2008, 2009. And I had the same experience of, oh my God, their trains, their roads, their infrastructure, they were so many years, they were light years, it felt like, almost ahead of us. I mean, maybe that's an exaggeration, but I thought, they're living in the future and we're the past. And that's not something that most people want to hear. It's very painful. It's, you know, it's very painful very painful to reckon with how we've ended up here. And not that we should be the dominant, that whole idea that in the world that we live in, that we have to be number one. That's just, you know, that's not the world we live in anymore. And so we want to stay in that world, but it's delusional. So I think that, you know, this touches in on some very vulnerable places, very painful places. And I think it's going to be the hardest for people who want to make America great again, because we're really, as far as infrastructure, we're decades of investment behind. It's not that we can't catch up, but what are we trying to catch up to? The world that we have to try to live in now is a different world, with climate change, with sustainability issues, with pollution, with globalization, with more pandemics likely because of the biodiversity loss, et cetera, et cetera. It's just, it's a whole paradigm shift. So.
Yeah, thanks. So we are a little bit over time. I know that, Gary wanted to just follow up on this, and I think this will be the last question for now, but just a reminder to everyone, Cynthia will be back tomorrow for another presentation, different topic, but hopefully extended conversation. So Gary, go ahead.
Thank you, Keith. And Ms. Lazaroff, I am sorry to do this because I'm sure you have other things to do this afternoon.
No, I'm here. I'm here.
All right. The issue that Keith's question struck, I think, is how one deals with stupid. You know, you're quite right that the issues that concern sustainability, that concern an intelligent health policy, any education, anything we want to mention, is how we confront stupid. Now, the advantage, if you might want to look at it that way, that China has is that it doesn't have any particular need to ask the governed what they think. If it wants if it wants a particular policy, if it wants to hold to a particular standard in sustainability or whatever it is, they can just do it. We can't do that. And so as a consequence, it seems like our political problem here is considerably more complex than what China has to face. Your thoughts?
I think that that's absolutely true. And it's also true, just to a similar extent in Russia. If they decide they want to do something, they do it, you know. And so I think that how do you deal with stupid? I think that one of the things that that one does is one brings in things that bring people together no matter what. So things that rise above. One of the things that I found that does that is indigenous wisdom. It goes back from the beginning of time, and, you know, at least historical record. And this might sound naive, but I've seen it work. You know, when you have an indigenous elder who is really bringing a group together, sharing breath, which we do here in Hawaii, sharing aloha. And you bring that spirit into a conversation that's deadlocked. You bring, you bring that something that brings us all together into a conversation. It shifts the conversation. So it's not necessarily easy to do, but it's also, you know, the power of music, as I mentioned, the power of things that take us out of our heads and our positions and into our hearts. And I think that's where we can find some reconciliation. And I have I'll try to make it a really brief example of this. This is going to sound, I just want to, this is a place of connection, which can be food. My son-in-law is from families from Pakistan and Muslim, and my brother, my sister-in-law's family has a whole group of people who are Trumpsters in the family and very anti-Muslim. We all shared a Christmas dinner, and we were a little nervous about how it was going to go. And aside from asking how his name was pronounced many, many times and things being separated, and the jokes made about the vegetarian soup that he and my daughter made, when the soup was tasted and shared, everybody loved the soup, and it became the connective tissue for the rest of the evening, where we didn't talk about politics, but there was a shift in the human connection. So it's that kind of healing work that needs to take place, that kind of take people to a place of connection in whatever way they can go, and out of the political rhetoric. And we have to do deep healing work in our country, and our institutions, to address your point about China, our institutions were designed for a world in the late 18th century, not to function in the world that we live in today. Our institutions are not up to, need to be adapted to be able to successfully function in this world. They were designed by white men of property in a world that didn't foresee what we're seeing today: globalization, climate, the power of corporations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, nuclear weapons. So we're at a crisis point in our country of gridlock, but it's not just about changing the people. It's about looking at how the institutions lend themselves to the gridlock and the two-party system and the supreme, everything. So it's a bigger conversation, but that's where I would leave it. And I know I just wanted to put some links in the chat for everyone that might be useful for things I referred to in the conversation. I'm seeing if they're gonna go in there. 1 second. They're not going in, so anyway. I can share them with you, David, afterwards, if you want to share them.
Great, thank you, Cynthia. And I just, again, thank you, and we'll take this conversation up tomorrow. I just want to preview tomorrow. You're really making me think about President Eisenhower in both sides of him, both the recognition of the military-industrial complex, which is one part of what's sustaining this policy of investment in military might. But then the second part, which is my sort of thought in response to Gary's observation, that I think you advocate and have faith in the power of inclusion and pluralism as actually bringing us a wider array of solutions to problems that might be deadlocked. And I think that was part of Eisenhower's call for people-to-people citizen diplomacy, which we'll be talking about tomorrow in greater detail. So again, thank you so much for this, for joining us today. Thank you everyone for joining, and we will get those, Cynthia's links we'll make available. David will capture them and share them with people who want to follow up some of those threads. And then if you want to follow up even more of the threads, please join us again tomorrow at 6 p.m. Arizona time, when Cynthia will be talking about her life as a citizen diplomat. So thank you again.
Thank you, everyone.